HBCUs. So, to start, Chinua Achebe famously recounted the great proverb, "Until the lions have their own histories, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And so my essay is really discussing why is it that at HBCUs we're still actually glorifying the hunter's story. And so I'm going to talk about curriculum in particular. I hope that it's not too much out of place, because we need to address some foundational biases as to why certain works are not a part of the curriculum at historically Black colleges and universities, which, as you know, were formed in order to educate newly freed slaves as well as their descendants. Most of these universities started in the late 19th century, and currently we have about 100 historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. And so I'll be coming from there. So in today's world where everything is seen as a journey, Pan-Africanist ideology has the possibility to be introduced, but as with the framework of journeys, also to be discarded. The current popularity and social environment at HBCUs, due in no small part to the success of Black Panther, the acknowledgement of police brutality, the nostalgia of grads who are now parents, and also the economic crunch that a lot of students find themselves, have driven students to HBCUs, many of them looking for Wakanda or looking for Umuofia or something that's more realistic to the state of Black people in the United States. Yet, as one student told me this past semester, and this was a senior, she had no idea of what Africana even meant until last semester. And again, this is at a historically Black institution. So assumptions about the discipline as well as funding are two key reasons why we don't find Africana or Black Studies programs at HBCUs. Likewise, a large part of the problem, even in generating classes that are African or Black centered, are not found, are not written, proposed, approved, or offered at HBCUs because it's seen as a posture of rebellion. And so many want to side with a system that is highly conservative in academic offerings and approach to teaching pedagogy. So this paper addresses the overall observation of the rejection of Pan-Africanism on these campuses via, one, non-native faculty inclusive of continental African and Caribbean faculty. Secondly, the bias against nonconformist Blackness, and then also a strict adherence to the Western canon of knowledge. The hope of this paper is that by vocalizing these problems, we can produce solutions that could very well validate, I think, an area of teaching that our institutions should be able to excel in by way of the very demographic. So first, there are already many studies that discuss the fiscal challenges that HBCUs face and encounter in trying to globalize the curriculum, much less focus on Africa in particular. Many HBCUs have an internal and eternal struggle with respective local, predominantly white institutions when it comes to duplication of programs that HBCUs need in terms of vitality and being able to justify their existence. Yet Africana Studies has not caught on as a program that HBCUs want to fight for or against in terms of program duplication or even to take on. So, but this paper is not about the financial challenges in securing federal funding and private donorship, but rather the institutional biases that prevent the budding ideas of programs from blossoming. This essay is not discussing larger institutions like Howard, Clark, Spelman, Norfolk State, Jackson, because those institutions have these sort of programs, but rather the smaller HBCUs who are associated or plagued with a lot of times the stereotypical problems associated with HBCUs. Okay, so where I'm operating from, or what I've been trying to think about, is what ideological challenges do most HBCUs face when it comes to Black or African American or Africana programs, and then putting all of these under kind of the umbrella of Pan-Africanism, because they all at some point address where it is that Africa comes in. You know, we know that there are differences between an African American Studies program and an African Studies program, but they all, as a common denominator, try to locate Africa. Okay, so the first thing is that you will be hard-pressed at an HBCU to not find members of the triangular road, as Paul Marshall says, and through the faculty, the staff, as well as the student population. According to Herschel Challoner, HBCUs employ a significantly higher percentage of continental African faculty members than do other U.S. institutions of higher learning. Yet the curriculum at HBCUs and frequent offerings do not reflect this presence. These faculty members in particular provide a wealth of lived experience as well as cultural and an intellectual framework or frameworks that could play an important role in the development of courses in a variety of areas. Their global knowledge could be used to compete for federal grant programs by allowing and encouraging them to use the diaspora in writing and development. However, most times faculty from the diaspora are hired more often than not to share the knowledge of the colonial masters that were associated with their respective countries. So for example, if a person is hired to teach French language and culture, then what the schools want to hear about really is France, not necessarily how the French language and culture operates in places like Algeria or Senegal. And so if a professor is hired to teach economics and they're asked to talk about transatlantic, people want to know about, okay, well, between the UK and the US, they're not necessarily wanting to know about Nigerian imports and exports and the African American population. So there's an element of preference when we talk about double consciousness, and HBCUs are not exempt. So when we talk about these hyphenated identities, unfortunately at HBCUs, people want the white portion of that hyphenated identity or what European country you're associated with. So the Me Too movement is making its way into HBCUs to discuss gender bias, but I've been wondering when it comes to racial and ethnic discrimination at HBCUs, when are we going to openly address those sorts of issues? Last semester, for example, I was asked to teach a class on negritude, in which I told the department head, I don't have the training for that or the linguistic skills for that at all. And yet we have 2 French-speaking PhDs on the faculty from 2 different countries in Africa who have not only the cultural experience, but also the educational background. And so you have to question, were those classes really wanting to be offered, or did they really want to offer the classes because we have people who are qualified to do so? Okay, so these are the sort of issues that we're having when it comes to African studies and African American studies at HBCUs. There are some programs or some universities who have sought to build bridges. And so we have, for example, Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, some years ago, had a presentation on how to teach things fall apart, taught by a Nigerian scholar who explained the names and their meanings in the text. And while that's not absolutely necessary in order to understand the book, it does add layers of understanding for the students and the faculty. And these are the sort of things that we need to start doing at HBCUs. Further, in terms of faculty intersectionality with course offerings, is the concept of Blackness amongst African Americans as an in-group, devoid of my first point about preferences concerning diaspora and faculty. African American faculty members who are visibly African-centered, again at smaller institutions, are oftentimes ostracized and painted as eccentric. Because HBCUs have concerns about image, and the verdict is still out on what it means to be professional or to look professional, these sorts of things are seen as microaggressions towards a perceived or a white agenda on campus. So many of these faculty members end up on the outskirts of the general faculty, which discourages collegiality, but also end up leaving for predominantly white institutions where they can be given funding as well as time to pursue their research. Whereas at HBCUs, they're put on the outskirts. I also want to say that I'm also aware that these faculty members many times will romanticize Africa, so I'm very much aware of that. But what they're really looking for is a historical point of connections in terms of identity. As an undergraduate student at an HBCU, I saw the rise and fall of Afrocentrism, right? So it was really big at one time, and so we had an administration where everyone, wore West African clothing. Some of them took African names and other outside showings of a perceived connection to Africa. And they were met with hostility from people who were already established at the university, and eventually, of course, were asked to leave. And so regardless of what type of Pan-Africanism these faculty members and administrators subscribe to, whether it's Marcus Garvey, Malefia Santi, or Malana Karanga, it's more so about changing ideas about what it means to be Black. Because the hyphenated existence has its own complexities, it is difficult for African Americans, I like to say, to invite other people to come and be Black with us, because we have not decided what it means to be Black. According to Ibram X. Kendi, professor of history and international relations, a major reason that Pan-African programs are missing at many HBCUs is because Black institutions fail to let go of a curricula that is 95% Eurocentric. While a few universities have designed concentrations or minors that reflect the diaspora and the continent, a decade after that article was written in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, there is still an overall lack in development of the curricula to give academic and scholarly validity to Black people, causing a disconnect between the student, the curriculum, and current scholarship. While students at PWIs can very well write essays about self-ownership, Black feminism, women in hip-hop, or the presence of Afro-Latinas in the music industry, at HBCUs, a lot of classes are still relegating students to Shakespeare's Macbeth or Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which, as you know, Jamaica Kincaid problematized, right, in her novel Lucy. And so we haven't, and when I say we, again, I'm talking about the smaller institutions, we haven't really moved past that colonial education phase for whatever reason. At my own institution, African American literature became a required course for English majors in 2010. So they could graduate with a degree in English at a Black institution and not take an African American literature course. So that's only been since 2010. Post-colonial literature was added in 2014, but it's not a requirement. As HBCUs attempt to globalize in the face of pressure about their existence, the curriculum gets further and further away from representing the history, the majority student population, and even trends in higher education. As many of you work at predominantly white institutions, you're at places where there are centers and there's a whole curriculum and even graduate studies programs where we're struggling just to create the courses and get support. Challoner also explains that HBCUs have a strong history of graduating students in fields of obvious employment such as biology, mathematics, agriculture, and computer science, but job opportunities in Africana studies have not been as clearly communicated, resulting in lesser interest from students. Olusoji Okamodofe, I'm sure I'm butchering that, says that administration's lukewarm support of the internationalization of the curriculum plays a large role in university-wide buy-in in what he calls Africanizing HBCUs. Further, he rightly observes that when a president pushes to institutionalize an international agenda of study, the ending of the president's term results in the disappearance of that program. This was the case at Fort Valley State University under the leadership of Kofi Lomote. So he created what was called the African World Studies Institute. But when he was given the vote of no confidence, he resigned in 2005. The African World Studies Institute shut down at that point because the new president said, well, what I want to do is incorporate regional studies that addresses Southern culture. And of course, that was never done. So it's more so about dismantling African World Studies than it was creating something else. Nothing ever took its place. And again, at my own institution, we have a program each spring called Wheel on the Hill that celebrates the birthday of Shakespeare. But we do not have a program that celebrates the birthday or the contributions of any Black writer, regardless of nationality. We had one professor to actually propose Chinua Achebe, but it never went beyond discussion. So my conclusion is an appeal to everyone involved in Pan-African studies. of any sort, because I believe the next step for Black studies and African studies, Africana studies, is actually to move the discipline into HBCUs. As it stands, Afrocentricity is seen by students at HBCUs as elitist. So if you've read Alice Walker's Everyday Use, many of my students see Afrocentricity as a philosophy for well-educated Black people to set themselves apart from everyone else. Yes, they do. Definitely, there are some segments in Pan-Africanism that must rethink how Blackness in Africa are presented to African Americans. Black studies survival on HBCU campuses is intrinsically tied to the Black intellectual tradition and collegiate genesis, but we must be honest about our embracing American while rejecting Africa and the complexity of double consciousness and how that extends into decision-making at our institutions. Many of our best Black fiction writers have actually addressed this. So Ellison in Invisible Man, as well as Nella Larson in Quicksand, you really don't get a positive perspective about HBCUs in those books. So their critique was that Blackness was quickly turning into looking for approval from white Americans by way of duplication. So at HBCUs, we have to face these challenges if our institutions are to live and see Africana studies as the natural birthright at HBCUs. So ending, Achebe tells us that writing the Lion story is not one man's job, it's not one person's job, but it is something we have to do, so that the story of the hunt will also reflect the agony, the travail, the bravery even of the lions. Thank you.
Next is Gabriel Ayoola and Ayoola.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes, I'd like to ask us first that the very first time we read Chinua Achebe Things Fall Apart, what was our impression? As individual, last time, for the very first time we read it, what was your own impression about the text? Is there anything in it that resonates with you in terms of cultural values and the language use and all of those? Why we keep that question at the back of our mind? The title of our presentation is on the literary translation of Achebe Things Fall Apart into Yoruba. And for some of us who might know or who might not know, Yoruba is widely spoken in Nigeria. It's one of the national languages in the country, alongside with Igbo and Hausa. Though we have some other ethnic languages, other languages which are not national languages, while English is the official language of the country. So Yoruba is one of the national languages, and it is widely spoken in the southwestern part of the country. And as we may also know that a lot of time when we talk about translation, translators, there are names people have given to translators. Some say, oh, translators are traitors, translators are impersonators, whatever reasons they have. But we're looking at the Things Fall Apart translation to Yoruba this morning with an approach called a within to within approach. That is, the approach that does not look from the Eurocentric point of view, but that looks into the African perspectives and cosmology in terms of the way it is being translated from what Achebe has into Yoruba. So to begin with, language is arbitrary, and translating one language to another can pose certain difficulties, as we know. These considerable difficulties, though, may make one language not commensurable when translated to another. However, Puerto Rico reassures that such incommensurability does not mean incomparability. Therefore, reading Achebe's Things Fall Apart in Yoruba as translated by Wale Ogunyemi in 1997, one cannot but see a near sameness, precision of language, culture, and cultural expression in the Yoruba translated text. And a careful examination of Things Fall Apart, though written in English, yet full of flora and fauna of Igbo traditions, and we've been talking about this since yesterday, make this paper to assume like perhaps we could take Things Fall Apart to be an Igbo text. Well, Achebe himself corroborated this assertion when he wrote in Gikandi 1991. He says, I'm an Igbo writer because this is my culture. Nigerian, African, and writer. No, black first, then the writer. So several African literary texts, whether written in African languages or English, have been translated into many European languages, we all know, but very, very few have been translated to African languages. Things Fall Apart has been translated into about 65 languages across the globe, which makes the text to be considered. Now, that kind of translation, we consider it in this paper as a within to without approach, being used in other words, that is, taking an African language or language, a text that is well garnished, well, embodied with the African culture into a culture or language that is not closely or mutually intelligible to Africa, as it were. So, the approach comes with its own peculiar translation challenges, as a matter of fact. However, translating the Things Fall Apart to Yoruba aims on a within-to-within approach. That is, taking a language and culture that is at least closer to Igbo culture and tradition. That's the within-to-within. Or also, taking an African language to translate another African language into another African language. And it also has its challenges too. So, but looking through an African lens, however, might offer a different dimension to the challenges of translation from one language to another. Rico underscores in 2006, and it says, linguistics hospitality, therefore, is the act of inhabiting the world of other, paralleled by the act of receiving the word of the other into one's own dwelling. The obvious from the assertion of Rico in relating to Achebe's Things Fall Apart is that the Igbo language is one of those languages that is very accommodating and hospitable to the other. Hence, the reason Ogunyemi achieves a near sameness Yoruba literary text translation of Things Fall Apart, which he titled Igbesi Aye Okonko, and a literary translation it means the life of Okonko. A within-to-within approach looks through the lens of a language and culture that is close enough or mutually intelligible enough. Although Things Fall Apart is written in English, but most scholars will agree that, well, this is Achebe writing in English. Just like we talked about yesterday, one of the presenters was talking about their own honing English, making it yours. But rendering an African literary text into another African language or languages, Ayoola, one of the scholars in Nigeria, advocates for a literary text that will not only be written in an African language, but also an English literary text written by Africans to be translated into African languages. To Ayoola, African literary texts and their writers should see their world and the society as an ecosystem. He says, historical conditions largely determine a writer's choice of language, but don't writers have a moral obligation to give something back to the literary ecosystem from which they initially drew their inspirations? According to Ayoola, Africans deserve to know what writers have taken from their societies. Perhaps one should say it is in the spirit of these moral obligations that make Ogunyemi attempted translation of the Things Fall Apart into Yoruba, and it is written, it is within this parameter of literary ecosystem as asserted by Ayoola, those elements and their renditions from the source text language Things Fall Apart to the target text the Igbesi Aye Okonkwo examines the challenges that make a translator either a traitor or otherwise. But going forward, I will be referring to Things Fall Apart as things, and Igbesi Aye Okonkwo, the target text in Yoruba, as Igbesi. So, we also agree that discourse in Africa is always cocoons in the use of copious proverbs, the use of aphorisms, anecdotes, and other figurative wise sayings, proverbs, and so on. So Ayoola says, to corroborate is that the palm oil, proverbs, according to Ayoola, is palm oil with which words are eaten. This shows that for any language to achieve the feat of near sameness translation, as we claim that Ogunyemi does, it might be very important for such a language to have equivalent textual materials to do so. So Yoruba, for one, is a language that makes use of proverbs, idioms, anecdotes, aphorisms, and so on. And for instance, a proverb that substantiates the idea of how important proverbs are sees proverb as a conveyance of expression and discourse that could easily communicate the crux of a discourse to the interlocutors. And Yoruba says, Owe leshin oro, oro leshin owe. Bi oro ba sonu, owe la fi wa. Literally translate that proverbs are the horses for the discourse, the horses that people ride on, and vice versa. A lot of discourse could be found through the use of proverbs. Here, the sense of good communication is determined by how well versed the interlocutors are in the use of proverbs. So let's quickly take a cursory look at the way proverbs are used and the way it is translated in the Yoruba text of talking about very quickly. One, I'll just cite a few examples as I run through the paper. Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. It's translated into Yoruba as Owe si leshin oro. Now, the context of that discourse came up when Okoye came to visit Unoka and was offered kola nut, and it went on to say, oh, the narrator says Okoye was a great talker. And so every of his speech is, noted with proverbs. And another challenge would be, if I were to translate this into English, do I have equivalent proverbs in English that captures this essence as used both in Chinua Achebe Things Fall Apart and in the translation, in the translated text, which is Igbesi Aye Okonkwo? Now, the question will be, I might not be able to do so very well. I might have to explain what that proverb really is. And in the process of doing so, I might have lost some vital information that this author this culture and this language is trying to transmit. Another example, if a child washed his hands, he could eat with kings. And Yoruba has the perfect equivalent proverb to fit into this proverb. And Yoruba will say, now, of course, in the text, Things Fall Apart, the narrator was talking about how great Okonkwo, has come a long way, becoming so, great achievement and relationship with the elders. And so he says, age was respected among the people, but achievement was revered. As elders says, a child who knows how to wash his hand with the elders. So the question is, if this approach of translating Things Fall Apart maybe to French or to German or to any other languages, will I have an equivalent proverb in that same culture that really exact or very close to express this thought pattern? As I move away, I have tons of examples of them, but are good. So, a lot has and can be said about Things Fall Apart and its impact on African literature and Africans. Our representation will be that it be what Niyi Oshundare, a poet, a critic, said about the impact of Things Fall Apart in the 50th anniversary of his text, and I read. Oshundare poet noting, 1965 was when I first read Things Fall Apart. I was in secondary school then. Things Fall Apart came at the right time. It was a time the WAEC, that is West African Examination Council syllabus, was being Africanized. We were lucky. Our set had Things Fall Apart in our WAEC syllabus as the text for prose. We had art texts from African poets like Professor Wole Soyinka, Gabriel Okara, J.P. Clark, Larry Peters from Gambia, Kofi Annan, and Warner from Ghana, and so on. Before Things Fall Apart were terrible books which were written by Europeans who portrayed Africans as fools, buffons, sorcerers, witches, violent and bloodthirsty people. And we as Africans were made to read these books as written by these racists. So, Things Fall Apart came as a refreshing alternative. It was the first time we read a novel written by an African that portrays our lives. We all loved it. Soon after, we took nicknames from characters in the books. For instance, one of our classmates was called Okonko because he was the man of anger. Above all that, those of us from the west and the southwest of Nigeria found that there were a lot of correspondences between Igbo culture and that of Yoruba, such as proverbs, the role of masquerades, and so on. The novel was not just an Igbo novel, but one that portrays the traditional African society, which every African can identify with. My favorite of his novel is Things Fall Apart. I've taught for over 35 years now. It represents Achebe's literary essence because of its delicate simplicity. Now this brings us to talk about the African literary text. As Ayoola in 2002 notes, the literary ecosystem from which the writers initially view inspiration is by moral obligation, deserving to be given back to the society where it was taken from. This idea of literary ecosystem informs the translation of Soyinka's Ake by Ayoola. Ayoola translated Soyinka's Ake, and which Ayoola claims to have not done a translation per se, but rather a language retrieval. Ayoola in 2010, though, says Soyinka writes in English, yet anyone who has the mastery of Yoruba language and its socio-cultural worldview would feel the deep echoes and nuances of Yoruba in that material. Therefore, the within-to-within approach of looking at things and the basic hinges on the Ayoola retrieval spectrum. One would agree that for a translator, translating proverbs, idioms, and so on is a very tasking, and sometimes the rendition of proverbs to English, especially from an African language, might become very challenging or have the meaning totally lost in the target language. No wonder Price in 2017 categorically stated that a good literary prose translation shows that language has not only a communicative purpose, but also societal and cultural flavors that distinguish the source text. The translator cannot escape the complexity of differences between cultures. When citing Walter Benjamin, he says that cultural difference, a problematic issue in translation, as the irresolution of all liminality of translation, the element of resistance in the process of transformation, that element in a translation which does not lend itself to translation. However, the good news is that the irresolution of cultural differences is minimal, especially when the two cultures in question are closely related as Igbo and Yoruba. However, this does not mean that Igbo culture is the same as Yoruba culture, but rather they are very, very close in terms of their cosmology, worldview, and believing ancestors, as well as other cultural practices. As highlighted in Things, there is a case of taboo among the Igbo, where children were warned not to whistle at night for fear of evil spirits. Also, a snake was never called by its name at night because it will hear. It is rather called a string. Now, the bottom line here is that these same taboos exist verbatim in Yoruba cultural milieu as well. Therefore, The society where Achebe drew inspiration from is not far from Yoruba society, where Ogunyemi drew his translation prowess from. This makes the work a retriever, as Ishola would say, rather than a translation per se. Except for a few linguistic lexicons that are very peculiar to Igbo language, to someone very groomed and well-versed in Yoruba language and cultural practices, the translation of things to Yoruba would pass for a Yoruba text exactly, because rendition flows smoothly like Yoruba text in its absolute. Things fall apart as Igbesi Aye Ogonko. Let's see the contribution of Wale Ogunyemi. Who is Wale Ogunyemi? Wale Ogunyemi, the translator, is a renowned Nigerian actor, playwright, and essayist, who for over 40 years before his death in December 18, 2001, became renowned for his plays such as The Vow, The Divorce, Langbodo, Kiriji, Ijayewo, Obaluaye, Queen Amina Zaza. Due to the fact that 5 of these plays were historical plays, he became renowned for being a playwright of historical plays. In addition to writing Obaluaye originally, which was in English, Ogunyemi also translated the work into Yoruba. Later on, he would expand his scope into the area of film scripting with scripts for movies like Shango, Ayonimufe, and so on. Remarkably, Igbesi Aye Ogonko, the Yoruba translator of Things Fall Apart, was the first translation of things into a Nigerian language apart from the Igbo language. As well, we will argue that here, things as well, many other classical Nigerian texts written in English deserves more translation into other Nigerian languages, not only because of the universality of these stories, but also as a way of expanding the scope of Nigerian literature and to bring these works closer to the same people from whose cultures the inspirations emerged. This is particularly important since most of the writers of these texts in English drew their inspiration as well, their identities and inspirations from these Nigerian languages. The translation of Nigerian and African literature written in English or other European languages into Nigerian and African languages returns the literatures to their roots and settle the predicament of distance between these texts and the context of the African audience. Habati 2000 reported, translation is a growing and promising enterprise in Nigerian literature, which ought to be encouraged. Before now, Akinwumi Ishola had translated Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman into Yoruba, titled Ikolo Question. Dapo Adeniyi translated D. Ofagunwa's Inikirindo, Ninu Igbe Lebeje to and Dr. Ogundeji also translated Femi Osofison's Who is Afraid of Sholarin into Yoruba as Yepa Sholarinbo, and so on. Wale Ogunyemi Obaluaye is equally bilingual, having been written in English and translated into Yoruba by its author. The translation of literature into indigenous languages may well win wider audiences, since in any case, more persons speak these indigenous languages and are closer to the experiences described in its literature. The challenge of translating proverbs and idioms. Now, from the samples that I mentioned about, from Achebe's Things Fall Apart and from the Yoruba translation, a translator faces a lot of challenge on how better to render the imports of those proverbs when translating, using a within-to-within approach. However, a retriever might not confront such a challenge because the approach is a within-to-within, which might make translators to look like a traitor. However, a retriever, as in the case of Things and Igbesi, does not face this challenge, having to explain a proverb or an anecdote in the target text, because both languages and cultures share some peculiarities, and as a result, the proverbs and idioms have the same semantic imports in both cultures. In conclusion, while it may be agreed that translators are traitors, especially with the within-to-without approach, it is important to note that it might not be in all occasions, depending on the approach employed. It might be argued that a within-to-within approach favors a retriever rather than translation, and in this case, a little or no challenges is confronted. It is equally important here that to advocate for more retrieval of some African literary texts written in African languages For instance, an Akan literary text can be retrieved in Twi and so on like that. And so while Chinua Achebe in things worked and succeeded in Africanizing English to convey the exuberance of the African experience, capturing its nuances, idioms, and indigenous use, Ogunyemi translation into Yoruba successfully captured the sound, the sense, the metonyms of Achebe's English version, according to Abati 2013. Notably, the translation of the Nigerian text Things Fall Apart into English with Igbo sensibilities has now been gifted to the Yoruba people with shared experiences of the havoc wreaked by colonialism. Thank you.